Good afternoon, everyone. Today I will be talking about Queensland's Coastal Hazard Adaptation Strategy Program, QCOST 2100. I'm joining from the lands of the Yugambeh and Kombumerri peoples of the Gold Coast of Australia, and I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where I'm presenting from today and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Australia is a coastal nation and is extremely vulnerable to coastal hazards that are escalating with climate change. Around 85% of Australian and over 80% of Queensland population live on the coast. In the last 10 years, various assessments have been made about the costs of coastal flooding, and all these assessments showed that Queensland is the most hazard-prone state of Australia. Queensland also has the largest number of assets and monetary value at risk from these events. Coastal erosion is not a new problem, but it's getting worse and more severe with climate change. And since the 1970s, we have not necessarily changed the way we are managing this. We just replaced the car bodies and the steel drums that we were using for seawalls with rocks, but we're still pretty much doing the same things. Our previous research into federal and state policies in Australia showed that in the absence of national guidance and leadership, adaptation responses across jurisdictions have been uneven across space. In addition to that, there's polarization between political parties on climate change that resulted in frequent reversals of climate policy every time there was a governmental change. So climate policy in Australia at all levels of government has been on a roller coaster ride, rising and falling depending on who is in government. And this meant that there was a temporal inconsistency in terms of climate policies. In addition to that, there has also been a spatial inconsistency across states. For example, some states have sea level rise benchmarks, some don't. Those that have different sea level rise benchmarks, and they constantly change in time as well. Queensland is the state that I chose in this study to examine local level climate adaptation policies for the main reason that it's the first state that started this kind of a program. In 2016, Queensland state government developed the QCOST 2100 Coastal Hazard Adaptation Program, and through this program funded local governments to develop coastal hazard adaptation strategies. All local governments in Queensland were eligible to apply, and out of the 45, 31 of them applied and obtained some funding towards this program. Out of the 31 local governments that have applied to the program, 23 of them so far produced a draft or final coastal hazard adaptation strategy. In this qualitative case study of the QCOST 2100 program, we systematically evaluated all 23 coastal hazard adaptation strategy documents, and in addition to that, conducted semi-structured interviews with key stakeholders that were involved in the preparation and implementation of these strategies. These stakeholders included representatives of local governments, consultancies, and program managers who include state Department of Environment and Science and Local Government Association of Queensland, as well as an expert panel which reviewed all the draft strategies before they were released to public. The plans included all major sea level rise adaptation strategies, from physical and natural protection to accommodation of the impacts through modifying infrastructure, as well as non-structural responses, including informing and raising awareness. However, most of the plans only considered public assets, and retreat was considered as a more long-term option and accommodated only through adaptation pathways approach. In terms of how the plans considered retreat, the first thing that was noticeable in the plans was actually avoidance of uses of the term retreat. Essentially, reframing retreat is not something new from United Kingdom's rebranding of it as managed realignment to other terminology like planned relocation, community relocation, resettlement, more recent terms such as graceful withdrawal has been common because of the controversial nature of the term retreat. So out of the 23 plans, only about 2 of them actually included the traditional language of protect, accommodate, retreat that has been around since, I think, assessment report 4 of the IPCC. Most of them at least replaced retreat with some other terminology. A handful of them used the term transition, and they talked about transitioning the assets to some other uses, assets and areas. However, a large number of these plans not only replaced retreat, but they also didn't like protect or defend as well. And this is also found quite controversial, especially due to seawalls, because there are supporters, people who own property around these areas want seawalls, which the governments usually do not want to pay for. And then there are environmental groups who are opposing seawalls because of their environmental impact. So they also don't like to use the language of protect or defend. So a lot of them found different terminology for these. Among the terms that they used was maintain, modify, and transform in a few of the plans. Most of them use the language monitor, mitigate, and transition. Part of the reason why so many of those use this language was because of the consultants that were involved in the process. So the 31 plans were produced by a handful of consultants mostly. 2 or 3 consultants collaborated at different stages of the project for each council, and 2 consultants essentially were involved in at least 10 or more of these plans. So these consultants actually were key in these plans having a common language. A few councils ordered the adaptation responses based on their suitability for different levels of risk, usually transition being considered only for higher levels of risk. And some of them actually mapped them based on time and put actually dates on the timeline and saying approximately about this time based on climate change projections that they will start considering the retreat. Interestingly, there was one council out of the 23 which did not actually include a retreat at all among the major strategies that it considered in response to coastal hazards. It wasn't because this council wasn't at risk from this. It was actually one of the councils that's very much at risk, but this is a very interesting council. So Noosa Shire Council is an area where environmental interests are very strong, but on the other hand, there's a couple of wealthy communities that are on the coast that are very influential and want their properties to be protected, and they were adamantly opposed to any language of retreat. So it doesn't show up in the major strategies, but buried in passing, it's mentioned in a few places within the document itself, only in relation to essentially recreation and infrastructure, public assets. One of the councils actually put these different strategies into a hierarchy of their preferred actions. In this hierarchy, it wasn't retreat that was at the bottom, it was actually protect. And this has to do with the fact that a lot of councils do not want to commit to actions that they cannot fund and that may also be controversial. And this is relevant for both any type of retreat as well as protection. So representatives of all types of interviewees were actually in agreement in the reasons for their reframing of the language retreat. They all wanted to avoid what they considered to be scary or confrontational language. They described retreat as being emotively harsh, and that it was something that would open up difficult or emotional conversations that they didn't really need to get into. And most of the time, interestingly, this change was promoted by the consultants who were actually in charge of managing the public engagement sessions. So we can think that they didn't want controversial or confrontational public engagement sessions. So on the other side of the fence, instead of this scary or confrontational language, they described the language that they wanted to use to be more diplomatic, more appetizing, to make the community more engaged. And they argued this would help them communicate better with the community. So 3 interviewees from 3 of the major groups, including the managers of the program, local governments, and consultants, did not only object to it because it would make consultations more difficult and confrontational, but they actually argued that the protect, accommodate, retreat language, they didn't think accurately represented the choices that was available in terms of adaptation. They found the defense retreat language, first of all, to be very combative and military language. And they said it implies defeat. It would mean we are beaten. And it makes it look like a us versus nature kind of a proposition, and an either or thing. You're either going to defend or you're going to retreat. So they argued that the alternatives were more productive, hopeful, or positive, and it would engage the public better. But at the same time, they suggested that it would also open up other choices besides defend or retreat, and then they could consider or have discussions around a stage process where you can change the use of the land, still continue to use it, but still gain some value out of it. So they suggested that retreat is using the term retreat and framing it that narrowly actually excluded those kind of discussions. So the risk profiles of the councils vary widely based on their location, degree of development. Some councils thought that retreat was really far away. They had plenty of time to deal with it before. It wasn't something that they needed to act urgently on, whereas other councils can actually pinpoint a few communities already, which were already they defined as not being viable. They already regularly went underwater in high tide. So they were talking about, they wanted to make it very, very clear, communicate to these communities that there isn't any other option for them, that they need to retreat at some point and that they should be looking after their own interests. So this actually means that local governments in Australia don't have any kind of large-scale funding to manage these kind of programs. Federal government doesn't get into this either. So essentially, the onus for private property at the moment seems to be on the owner. Adaptation pathways approaches were actually used to kind of postpone discussions of retreat in detail to sometime in the future. I put two examples in here. One of them is from the Gold Coast, where you can see that retreat discussions under the label of transform are something that will come in about 50 years time. That's where they are foreseeing 50 centimeters of sea level rise, and that's when they will start considering relocation of assets at risk. Other councils also tied it to different levels of sea level rise, but depending on how conservative or progressive the councils are, they may start considering it at 2 meters. So some consider this approach kicking the can down the road, and they said that, but this kicking the can down the road using a trigger-based approach tied to time or a level of sea level using adaptation pathways was actually really palatable for the elected officials who had about 4-year terms. But participants, whether they worked in council or consultancy, were overall actually happy that these conversations have actually even started within councils and communities. And the idea was that within 20 years' time, when there's going to be action, they would actually be ready for it. So in summary, retreat discussions have been politically charged and controversial, and the term is usually avoided where possible, using more softer terms like transitioning and repurposing. The coastal hazard adaptation strategies viewed retreat as something that's going to happen in the future, earliest in about 20 years' time. Because these were really high-level strategic documents, difficult conversations were avoided through pathways approaches, etc. But all the participants discussed that the real controversy will start when the way they described it, when the rubber hits the road, and these strategies are starting to be incorporated into local planning schemes or even lower level localized plans for actual communities. However, the problem is that because current plans and discussions do not provide a roadmap on how retreat can happen and be financed, when that time comes, we may still be caught unprepared because there isn't even small-scale pilot studies on how they would be financed or managed. So those discussions, these plans did not help those discussions to start. Thank you very much.
Cool. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. It's great to see you all here. My name is John Nelson. I am presenting from my dissertation, which I completed a couple of years ago at Brown University. I'm currently teaching at the University of Rhode Island. My work is based mostly in Rhode Island, though there's some statistical analysis from the rest of New England. I forgot to put in a method slide. I just want to talk a little bit about how I came to this. Are we good, tech people? All right.
Sorry.
No, it's okay.
So why is the Zoom? Okay, all right. So you share, right? Then go to this full screen. Then share.
You selected the wrong screen.
Yeah, it should be fine.
Is that good?
All right.
Okay. Oh, we shared the wrong screen.
It's all good.
Yes, we're good. Okay.
Okay, we're back. Great. Thank you. So my research is based on review of all 39 municipalities, hazard mitigation plans, comprehensive plans, interviews with about 70 different stakeholders, including property owners, planners, politicians in towns, as well as numerous site visits. So what I'd like us to do today, hopefully, Yes, all right. So I want us to think about, this is kind of a multi-scalar question, right? And I love that the previous speaker kind of got into that, talking about Queensland and then the cities and towns that came up with these plans, and then the individual people responding plays kind of nicely into this. And so I want us to think about individual level climate equity and justice concerns and how that ties into local planning capacity and the federal adaptation programs that those localities are able to take advantage of. All right. So we'll see how much of this I get through. I kind of have like a little off ramp in the middle of it. But I want to think a little bit about what is land? What is it we mean when we're talking about this concept? Adaptation as a reaction to impermanence, comparative meanings of land in 2 case study communities that I examined, adaptation strategies and their relations to the meanings of land. And then we'll look at a managed retreat plan, an elevation plan, Army Corps of Engineers study, and a conclusion. Again, some of this, if I end up rushing through things. So great. So what is land, right? What is it? So it's this physical entity, right? We can look out the window and say, all right, we're not in the middle of the ocean. This building is built on land, right? It's a physical entity, but at the same time, it's subject to social construction of meaning, right? Land can be many things, right? It can be, especially in Western capitalist societies, property, right? It can be a source of wealth and social status, right? We see that a lot, especially in our oceanside communities, okay? And a lot of what we're thinking about is how to balance ecological and economic priorities. It can be nature, right? We say this land is outside of the scope of human activity. It is nature to be protected. It can be toxic, right? We have brownfields, abandoned industrial sites. We say this land is risky, right? We shouldn't really do anything more there. We need to stay away, all right? But overall, land is permanent. When we think about land, right, we think about solid ground. Historically, the assumption has been that land will always be there. And what we all know, of course, those of us who are here, is that that's no longer always the case, right? And so we're entering into an era where we have a new sort of wrinkle or a discordant definition of land. A great deal of land that is important to many different groups of people is now temporally bounded, right? Land now comes with an expiration date, right? So many feet of sea level rise are forecast in the next so many years, and that's going to eliminate, Y acres of land, right? This land is going to disappear. And the problem here is that our social institutions, the definitions that we use, the ways that we measure wealth, they're based on the permanence of land, okay? And so I think I want us to think some here about adaptation as a reaction to impermanence, okay, and how different groups are able to accommodate that or refuse to, okay? So adaptation as reaction to impermanence. Landowners, local officials, the federal government, everyone involved, all the stakeholders must adapt to impermanence. They might deny it, but adaptation will take some form with them sooner or later, right? But in that adaptation process, they are still bound by laws and institutions that assume or depend on permanence. What are some examples? Regulatory takings, an eminent domain, right? We value property for its use in perpetuity, right? you buy a plot of land, part of that value of that lot is the ability to make use of it, right? To exclude others from it forever, right? If it was just for a year, well, that would be renting, right? And you would pay a different price. But now we're renting land from nature, the land that does have that new expiration date. But our laws require us to treat it as though it exists in perpetuity. Property tax dependent budgets, our cities and towns, right? They're creating infrastructure, they're building communities that need this property tax in perpetuity to function, right? They need these cash flows in order to function as governmental entities, right? Our infrastructure and the maintenance thereof, right? We talk about a 50-year, 70 or 100-year design life for a road or a bridge, right? These are standards that engineers use, right? That's how long it's going to take until we need to replace something. But now there are things we won't be able to replace or may not even live out their quote unquote natural lifespan. And so here are two communities, okay? And what you see here is the current sea levels, the 100-year storm, and I apologize, it's a little bit washed out, right? This is the 100-year storm, no sea level rise. One of them chose elevations, the other one chose buyouts. Okay, and I've purposely hidden some information, but can I just see a show of hands? Who thinks the right-hand side chose elevations? One, two people? All right, y'all should be, be like, okay. So everybody else thinks the right-hand side chose elevation, sort of by default. You'd be right. Y'all are maybe see that sign Shore Road. That's probably a pretty good indication, right, of the kinds of communities we're dealing with. I tried to hide Atlantic Avenue down here, but Shore Road, there was no getting around that. So if we look here, we see this here is from Westerly, which for you Swifties out there, Taylor has a home down on Watch Hill. All right. This is, however, the Misquamicut, which is a slightly lower but still upper class community, right? And the other one is way up here, Warren, Rhode Island. It's kind of a old mill town. This flooding is centered on a low and moderate income census tract. Okay, so Westerly has focused their attention on elevations, and Warren has decided to go with buyouts, right? And so I thought about, well, what is it about the land in these two different places that supports the town's decisions to go with these two very different adaptation strategies? So as I said, Warren, right? This is a low and moderate income census tract, right? And I talked with planners in this region about it. They're like, you got to talk to Warren, right? They have, tract 305, right? It's low and moderate income, right? It kind of has that almost a stigma or special significance to all of the players in the area, right? Versus Westerly, right? Where we have this seaside vacation neighborhood, which is kind of an economic driver, right? Warren, mostly rental properties, Westerly businesses and vacation homes, low property values and low taxes in Warren, whereas in Westerly, we're looking at a key component of their economy and of their tax base, right? One is thinking about land as permanent, right? Well, you really want to keep that land use around in Westerly, but, in not too many years ago, we might be thinking about Warren as a target for quote unquote urban renewal, right? Warren, increasingly untenable for settlement as sunny day flooding is increasing in this neighborhood. It's increasing in Westerly too, by the way. You saw, right? The topography and the vulnerability is very similar, but Westerly, is worthy of protection and investment, right? Unlike Warren, right? But the land in Warren is a potential source of natural capital. So part of the buyout plan is restoring this region to nature, okay, to building a salt marsh there. And in Westerly, really the most important thing it can do is give us tax and income for residents. And finally, land is threatened, right? Adaptation and evacuation is urgent in Warren, but land is threatened in Westerly, but it's too valuable to leave it before we absolutely have to, right? And these, feed in nicely to our distinction between buyouts and elevation, right? We're going to cash out property value versus investing and borrowing to protect a home, right? We have to deal with uncertainty, the possible loss of community where we do buyouts. Elevations are expensive, they're inconvenient, right? But they don't necessitate loss, right? They don't precipitate loss. Buyouts are relatively simple to engineer and execute over a large area, right? Whereas elevations require intricate engineering and cost benefit analyses for every single property involved, right? So we're starting to see here the difference between the capacities required, right, by the different towns that want to go one way or the other. For a town with limited capacity, buyouts, maybe are more attractive than home elevations, right? Buyouts remove risk permanently, whereas elevations, simply push it into the future. And finally, buyouts maybe could be thought of as freedom from high risk property versus elevations, which give us a longer tenure in a safer property, right? And of course, potential tax revenue loss versus tax revenue increases. And I guess I want to leave you here with FEMA's sort of perspective on this. What is it that, if we're thinking about this as a menu, right? If both of these things are on the menu for our cities and towns across the country, well, as far as FEMA is concerned, right, they're both funded through all of the grant programs that are available, right? They don't really care which one you do, so long as the cost benefit analysis works out. If we look at the community rating system for the relative valuation, turns out there's a little bit of a bonus for people for towns that do buyouts versus elevations, but both are valuable. But the cost benefit analysis really delimits the decision maker's choice set, right? So where those homes are less valuable, elevation really isn't even an option, right? Because it costs so much more than doing a buyout, right? Where those property values are depressed. So to conclude, right? So managed retreat is sort of one item on this wider menu that does include elevations, right? And so a lot of research kind of ignores elevations, but I think we really need to take that seriously. They make perfect sense if land is permanent, right? Going back to this question of definitions, but if we accept the impermanence of land, then elevations, kind of conflict with that eventual loss of territory, right? They only delay inevitable losses. And our local understandings of land, right, the ways that our town planners, our citizens, our voters are thinking about land influence town officials' decisions on which to pursue. And if you choose the wrong one, right, you might very quickly find yourself out of a job, right? So in general, wealthier areas where land provides wealth and status, right, where land has this higher social valuation, broadly construed, will be targets for elevation, whereas these poorer areas, especially where land is a liability, a source of risk, will be targets for relocation. And I think this all actually feeds very nicely into Dr. Mock's presentation. So thank you so much. I have a lot of other slides if y'all want to look at those later, but thank you so much. I'll hand it over to the next person.
Okay, hi and welcome everyone. Sorry for the loud voice. My name is Jen Marlow. I'm an assistant professor of environmental law at Cal Poly Humboldt, and this is Alec Brown, a graduate student at Humboldt and my collaborator. We're here to represent the 44 Feet project and talk about vulnerabilities, opportunities, and strategies for managing climate and coastal hazard risks to Humboldt Bay's spent nuclear fuel site. Imaged here in red, licensed in perpetuity, on a bluff 44 feet above Humboldt Bay on the northern coast of California. In this image, islanded in a projected future sea level rise scenario. The existing seawall and access road in front of the site may be overtopped and exposed to bluff, and the bluff in front of the site may be exposed under 2 meters or 6 feet of projected future sea level rise. And so far, PG&E, the licensee, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission say that the site is safe and assume best case scenario and take a zero risk approach to the worst case scenario. So we're questioning that. The 44 Feet is a project of Cal Poly Humboldt Sea Level Rise Institute. There's 3 goals. One is to fill in gaps in the existing safety analysis to account for increased future coastal hazard risk to the site. Second, to affirm the desire for community and tribal perspectives to meaningfully contribute to future decision-making. And third, to essentially build values in the ideas that public trust, communication, and awareness must rank equal to science in future decision-making over risk assessment, over what responsible spent nuclear fuel management looks like. Our presentation is going to just describe the site, our research, and some recommendations going forward. And Alec and I are sharing the presentation.
Thank you, Jen. Jen kind of alluded to it earlier, but something we hope to convey in this presentation, and something maybe you should walk away with today, is that, well, first, commercial spent nuclear fuel is effectively stranded at nuclear reactor sites across the nation. And we're questioning, in this status quo, whose values, whose visions, whose interests and aspirations should we look to inform climate adaptation planning and nuclear safety decisions? And so our idea here is to, in light of the real challenges of building power and authority at the local and state levels, can we build power? Can we empower communities to deal with this, especially those that are at the interface of spent nuclear fuel storage and climate change? And so we hope that you can get that. But I'm going to take a step back really quick. It's important to understand how Humboldt Bay and similar communities with in situ spent nuclear fuel came to be. And I'd like to talk quickly about a trend that's happening. After a long period of decline, nuclear is having a moment of sorts, a renaissance. It's following an investment in energy security and carbon neutral energy alternatives. So for example, the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 provides several production tax credits for operating plants, $700 million to develop a domestic uranium supply, and $150 million for research and development. There's also the $6 billion civil nuclear credit program, which is designed to prevent premature retirement of existing nuclear power plants. And so on paper, it looks like nuclear is making a comeback. This is despite a spent nuclear fuel impasse that's decades long now. Many of you may know about this, but our nation does not have a permanent repository, although Yucca Mountain in Nevada is designated as that legally. But the regulatory design is what has essentially caused this spent nuclear fuel impasse. For example, the Atomic Energy Act of 1954 grants sole authority over all radiological aspects of safety and storage to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So this leaves very little regulatory authority to state or local governments to handle or even collaborate on plans to deal with this issue. And then, of course, we have the 1982 Nuclear Waste Policy Act, which mandates ownership and possession of all commercial spent nuclear fuel in the US to the Department of Energy. And Yucca Mountain is still legally the place to put it, but it's not available at this time. And that leads us to a status quo, where across the nation, there are 84 independent spent fuel storage installations. We call those ISFICs, across 36 states. And we're storing approximately 92,000 metric tons of spent nuclear fuel, a value that will go up by about 2,200 metric tons per year. And so this, in the absence of a permanent geologic repository, commercial nuclear power plants store this in this fashion. And there's been some minor progress in licensing a private facility in New Mexico. Unfortunately, the timeline for waste retrieval is still uncertain, as is, the protocol for deciding which sites will be prioritized to send their waste there. So the status quo of leaving spent nuclear fuel sitting on site at nuclear power plants raises several safety concerns, of course, and we'd like to talk about that quickly. The Humboldt Bay ISFICI is the second smallest storage installation in the US, yet it is classified as one of the most at-risk sites to climate change. And so to understand this problem at the local scale, we were kind of at the national scale. Let's zoom in a bit. Northern California, we're zooming into the site. There are 6 casks here. Jen mentioned that it's Pacific Gas and Electric, a private utility company that owns this facility. They are stored in dry cask, a dry cask system like you see here, 37 metric tons. And this is kind of what that looks like. However, the site is not designed for permanent storage. It's not really suitable for permanent storage. Interim, yes, but perpetuity, I'm kind of linking back to John's presentation, nothing's permanent anymore. Yet, due to the lack of a feasible alternative storage location, the California Coastal Commission assumes the ISFICI site will exist on site in perpetuity. They have to. They have no other route to question otherwise. PG&E also has established that there are currently no offsite alternative locations. We know that. That sentiment is also reflected in the Blue Ribbon Commission to the Secretary of Energy in 2012, whereby the storage arrangements in place today were not designed to maximize operational efficiency, nor to respond to unforeseen events. So the moment you've all been waiting for, maybe, what are these unforeseen events? Shoreline retreat, bluff erosion. We've seen it, we've documented it, it's happening in Humboldt Bay. We also have seismic hazard risk. So we live in a very geologically active place. And then, of course, sea level rise risk. Tidal inundation, this is 1 meter of sea level rise on top of a king tide. This would leave the waste stranded in more ways than one. So despite rapidly developing science on climate change, sea level rise, and plate tectonics, David McIntyre of the NRC basically assumes that there's no accident scenario that would lead to a radiation release. We're not satisfied with that, of course. We refer to our original question then, who should lead in the nuclear safety journey? And our answer to that is the 44 Feet project. The 44 Feet project is forward thinking, it's transdisciplinary, it's collaborative, it's a research project that brings together state agencies, scientists, tribes, the utility, of course, community members, everyone together to guide and understand what responsible spent nuclear fuel management might look like. And so we conducted interviews with 24 diverse participants to try to understand what's driving change, what's really happening. And then we took those drivers of change that were identified and we applied them in scenario planning focus group workshops, a series of them, where we brought people together, we explored the drivers, we plotted these drivers on an X and Y axis, and this is what it produced, a really valuable qualitative heuristic to understand what worlds are coming together, essentially, for really visceral worlds that you can live in. What we came to understand is that, we are currently, the Humboldt Bay community is currently in the deep sleep quadrant, The main concern then, if using this heuristic, is to understand how do we get to empowered safety while avoiding nightmare scenarios. And so with that, several recommendations came to be, and I will pass it on to Jen and let her talk about those.
So I'm going to quickly go through some recommendations from our focus group workshops. These also developed after a thorough review of a bunch of PG&E safety documents, state permitting documents, workshops, conversations, and these generally trended toward recommending collaborative strategies. No single pathway, as would be evident from this conference. Let me go through, this is the list, which should be, it should be 6. The numbers didn't convert when we converted the slideshow to a PowerPoint. So maybe we do have one singular, really long recommendation. I want to go through them quickly just to give you a sense of our recommendations. And this one is kind of ironic because it's to support expansion of federal oversight below the federal level. So in some ways, this insistence on a lead federal agency that we've been hearing about needing, this institutional gap that's really apparent in the lack of a federal framework for managed retreat. In the nuclear space, there is a very strong federal preemption. There's, at the nuclear regulatory preempts the field because of the statutes and control radiological release, anything related to it. And so the question when you have 36 states storing fuel is, what is the role of the states storing this fuel? What is the role of the communities living with this fuel? Should the NRC maintain federal preemption? And maybe there's just needs to be more of an alignment between federal, state, tribal authorities so that future planning can be integrative of community values and needs, as well as best available science, which we're not seeing currently represented in safety assessments. So this is the idea. We're not in a situation where we need a technological solution. We're in a situation where we need political will and partnership building and collaboration and dialogue and courage. James Hamilton, Executive Director of the Nuclear Decommissioning Collaborative and a participant in our project. So this is emerging from that statement is a couple of recommendations to design a collaborative ISFSI task force to essentially address information gaps and caucus with broader efforts. This would be done at the community level and connect with Congress people, including efforts to develop bipartisan bicameral legislation that would amend the Nuclear Waste Policy Act from 1982 to prioritize removal of spent nuclear fuel from high-risk sites facing multiple hazards. There has been a proposed bill, HR 3862, which would need to be modified to include Humboldt. But it's a start. Additionally, California has 3 nuclear facilities, and we would like to emphasize the need to form a statewide independent scientific advisory and ethics panel to examine emergent climate and coastal hazards to the 3 nuclear sites in California, the Humboldt Bay ISFSI, Diablo Canyon, whose license is very likely to continue despite efforts to terminate it in 2025, and Songs and San Onofre. Second recommendation, assess multiple failures via joint fact-finding. This is really needing to be done by these independent scientific community and ethics committees to advise the process, not just taking the utilities' word for it, which NRC seems to do. People have, I think, the erroneous confidence that it's just taken care of. If we have a breach of those casks, what are we looking at? Janet Gagnon, Sustainability and Government Affairs Director from the Blue Lake Rancheria, a local tribe. So we do need updated science, storm wave, sediment transport, hydraulics, tsunami, soil liquefaction, and acute and chronic hazard interaction modeling, so we can understand how these cascading effects will impact the site in the future. Like what will happen when the jetties at the mouth of the bay are submerged by sea level rise, what changes to the hydraulics of the bay, what happens to the wave energy action directed at the bluff. How do we understand the future of the site with climate and coastal hazard impacts clearly considered? We need to assess impacts on the bluff, the seawall, how to get the waste out. If the Highway 101 is inundated, the site is islanded, how are we supposed to get the waste out? Obviously, we'll need to mitigate these hazards in time. I'm just going to switch, go quickly through these last 3. Reevaluate and redesign the site. We clearly know it's not based on, the design is not based on the best information related to sea level rise. It was cited there before we had a better understanding of this, warrants reevaluation. Recommendations include having a long-term plan required post 2032, which is when PG&E assumes the Department of Energy will retrieve the waste. I think it's the writings on the wall that that timeline is going to be exceeded. And so there needs to be a qualified plan for inspection, maintenance, repair, and retrieval that considers sea level rise and coastal hazard risks to the site, the waste, the riprap wall, and the critical transportation routes needed for access. I'm going to skip a couple of other these, but maybe I'll say one thing, which is reviewing emergency procedures. Most emergency personnel in our community had no directive, very few preemptive responsibilities to organize a contingency plan around a radiological release. A current civil grand jury report is now recommending a contingency plan done by the county to integrate emergency personnel around a future hazard scenario, which is a great, I think, outcome of some of our work. The fourth recommendation is for Congress to revise NRC regulations and PG&E standards for high-risk ISPC sites. Basically just making sure that they're aligned with best available science. Some of the reporting from PG&E to NRC dates back to the 90s and actually assumes sea level rise is uplifting, or it assumes that the plate tectonics in our region is uplifting when in fact the land is sinking, which is, you know, a huge flawed assumption that needs to be corrected. The casks need to be reevaluated for beyond their design life for future projected sea level rise and coastal hazard scenarios, which they're not currently. I think I'll just wrap up. I have a couple more slides, but basically we need to enhance public engagement, and we need to look at accident scenarios too. So accident scenarios for beyond design basis or nightmare events as our community focus groups examined in the scenario matrix that you saw. There is certainly that possibility. It's deemed not to be credible to look at these beyond design basis accidents by the NRC and by PG&E, but we recommend, as the Union of Concerned Scientists have done, that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission indeed look at beyond design basis accident scenarios for spent nuclear fuel sites at high risk to climate and coastal hazards. Our real goal is to, again, push us into this space of embracing uncertainty and building public process into a regulatory and statutory regime that essentially has designed the public process out, and to think about what long-term spent nuclear fuel management looks like on Humboldt Bay, and with the more aligned whole of government and whole of community approach. So I think I'll just end it there. And if we can get our contact information, I'll share that, which has a QR code at the end to our focus group report, which is the output of our workshops and goes into much more detail about these recommendations. And I'll just mention also, we're hiring a graduate student fellow to join us fully funded starting in the fall. So if anyone's interested, there's information on our website, 44feetproject.com, the about page. And here's our contact. Thanks.
That's
Great. All right, we'll see how the technology goes. I think it perhaps may be set up. Thank you all for hanging in there. I know it's been a wonderful whirlwind few days, and maybe you're getting ready for your afternoon coffee. It's a pleasure to be presenting some of the work we've been doing focused on different perspectives on diverse forms of climate mobility in South Florida. This is a set of studies emerging from 76 interviews with adaptation relevant practitioners in the region, or those who are focused on the region. I'll just point out Nadia Cedaram in the audience is a co-author on this work, and Jennifer, who is listening in online, also has been very actively participating. So first, a little bit about South Florida, for those of you who may not know the region. On the left hand of the slide there, we see an image of the state of Florida, South Florida being the southernmost portion of the state. When it comes to climate change, this is a very exposed region. Counties in South Florida are already among the most flood-exposed counties in the entirety of the United States. Further, the bedrock in the region is both porous and permeable, meaning the challenges of intensifying hurricanes, storm surge, and sea level rise into the future pose a lot of risk, not just of flooding, but also permanent inundation. And if that isn't enough, it's also a chronically hot and humid region that really mixes in the nature of the threats that unfold. Against this backdrop of a lot of climate exposure, perhaps surprisingly, this has been a region of immense development. You can see two images, basically the same view of downtown Miami, underscoring the amount of development that has happened in this region over the last century. In a project we'll be presenting tomorrow morning, we've measured every single housing unit that has gone into the floodplain across the United States over the last 2 decades, and half of those have gone into the floodplain in Florida alone. So how is climate mobility being loosely considered in the region so far? Given the hurricane exposure of South Florida, this is a region where displacement to and from the region has occurred following hurricanes. Some of that has become permanent, one form of climate migration. There are also very intense debates around the phenomenon of climate gentrification, whereby the indirect, secondary, and cascading impacts of climate change displace residents from low-income communities of color, where their residences in those safe areas of high ground often are directly interlinked with histories of racist land use planning. When it comes to retreat, the third form of climate mobility that I'll be unfolding, the classic tension here is that if you live in the region and you do research on the region, you usually want to be really careful about saying retreat. It is incredibly hard to consider processes of retreat in this region on the ground, at the same time that everyone looking to Florida says retreat all the time. So what we did was talk with 76 different practitioners that I'll introduce in just a moment. And we didn't really start with climate mobility. We focused first on, what are the goals of adaptation in this region, where processes of resilience and adaptation are very well advanced. Next, recognizing that any form of climate mobility carries a lot of harms as well as benefits, we next positioned these different forms of climate mobility in adaptation pathways that ideally would be advancing towards the goals that exist right now for adaptation in the region and that may likely evolve through time. And then we explored constraints and enablers towards more proactive planning for climate mobility in different forms. We spoke with 76 different practitioners across diverse contexts of local, state, regional, and federal government, very diverse domains of the private sector and nonprofit organizations, as well as researchers. The 2 bars here in each color indicate the primary affiliation of each person we spoke with, as well as any other affiliations they had. And this is a region where people float between a lot of different roles. So you might have a researcher who serves on a city commission, or someone who moves between the public and private sector across election cycles. Our IRB protocol for all of these interviews indicated that we would not reveal the identities of the people we talked with, and we heard again and again from these individuals who are incredibly prominent in their professional roles that they were much more able to speak openly about these tense, difficult issues because their names were not on the record. So first, positioning what we heard about this broader context of climate adaptation, Square One was asking them what are their climate hazards of concern. And whether it's for the next 1 to 3 decades or the longer term around the end of the century, we heard the same 4 things: hurricanes, sea level rise, flooding, and extreme heat. But as they look towards the end of the century, their concern around sea level rise and extreme heat went up in particular. Next, in terms of setting the stage, we asked them what priorities do they personally have for adaptation in the region versus what do they perceive to be currently prioritized in responses unfolding right now. And so the main take home was that there was a broader range of personal priorities. Around 50% of the responses said that infrastructure, social equity and justice, finance, and disaster risk reduction were the priorities that they had. But when they looked to responses happening right now, over 50% of the responses focused on a predominant emphasis on infrastructure and finance. That's perhaps not that surprising for those of us who participate in adaptation in the region really heavily. The final stage setting thing was to ask about strengths and weaknesses in current climate responses from their deeply informed professional perspectives. The idea here was to understand if these different forms of climate mobility can happen either as an impact or as a proactive response. How does that interact with both what's working well right now as compared to the greatest challenges? So again and again, individuals pointed to people as the great strength of adaptation in the region. Some of you might have heard of the South Florida Climate Compact or other groundbreaking initiatives in the region that have really pushed towards collaboration, coordination, networks, and building capacity. So for example, one local climate resilience officer said, "I think our region is outstanding in terms of the level of cross-sector collaboration and cross-jurisdictional and corporate collaboration. The social capacity of people who are working on this issue, that is truly one of our greatest strengths." In a theme that would come up again and again and again, when we asked about the greatest weakness, what we heard is the lack of a transition plan. So for example, someone saying, "I am not sure that people understand the fact that the institutions we have now won't work." And there's a general lack of creativity about thinking about designing things that don't exist yet. We then, in this last stage setting question, asked them about things that are being emphasized right now to some degree, either a lot or a little, as a major option or a minor option, that they are worried might not pan out in the long term, might not materialize, or if it does, it might fail at some point. And so number one on this list was a concern that long-term transition plans that smooth trajectories of damages through time might not materialize or soon enough. There were also a lot of concerns around some of the forms of infrastructure given our challenges of that porous, permeable bedrock. So for example, seawalls and pumps and our general historic mechanisms of stormwater management may not take us as far in this region. So for example, in this region that has water on all sides, one local government and researcher combined role said there are about 4 different ways we can get flooded out. And the seawall only addresses one of those 4. That's the biggest piece of policy myopia I've seen so far. Another leader in the space of water said pumping is like a temporary band-aid. Some days you have some flooded streets and you need to dry those streets. It is not going to take you into the next century as a solution, and it's extremely polluting. So from there, we turn to climate mobility explicitly, asking first on their perspectives for these different forms: climate migration, climate gentrification, retreat. What does it mean to them? Do they perceive these different forms of movement of people to be occurring now or into the future? And for each of these different forms of climate mobility, 59 to 71% of respondents thought they were occurring to some degree right now. If you ask them about the future, though, the numbers go way up. The second bar in each pair, 98% of responses said, yes, this is going to be happening into the future. So how to think about that shift from where we are right now with climate mobility in South Florida and what the future might hold? We next ask how they see the differences between what is happening now and what might happen in the future. So for the current day, and I apologize that all these response sizes are microscopic, especially for the back of the room, what we really heard is that perceptions of climate mobility are that right now, to the degree it is occurring, it is small scale, and oftentimes the importance of climate is unclear. I think for those of us who work as researchers in this space of climate impacts and responses, what is the role of climate is a recurrent question that comes up again and again. So one local government resilience officer said, it's hard to define what is regular gentrification, regular migration versus climate. And something that we've grappled with ourselves in working on this issue in the small ways that we have is how much does it matter what the causes are for us in the different responses on the table? A really interesting and provocative perspective. Turning to the future, the realm of concerns in terms of understanding what it might look like became a lot more diverse in terms of seeing people saying again and again, these are themes that arise for them. And the basic thrust here was an emphasis that there is likely to be climate mobility at much bigger scales, with the real question being whether it will be proactive, deliberate adaptation, or reactive, forced impacts in terms of how it materializes. So for example, another local government resilience officer said, there are areas where you'd have to have a pump producing or operating at 6,000 cubic feet per second in order to maintain the current groundwater table. Even if you could do that, where would you discharge the water? How long can you keep up with that? What does the decay of that community look like with time? Maybe we end up using taxpayer dollars to acquire those properties in order to create larger scale stormwater management areas. We next turn to the theme of why is this issue, climate mobility in different forms, so hard to discuss openly in a relaxed way, in an open-ended way, and thinking about productive, supportive, adaptive pathways into the future. And in terms of the nature of awareness, everyone really thought that the discussions are going up, whether it is residents in the region or these adaptation relevant professionals with whom we spoke. But in terms of why this is a hard issue to talk about, the themes emphasized really reverberate, not just with experiences in South Florida, but what we've certainly been hearing from many other regions of the world at this conference over the last few days. For example, they're the financial dimensions. What do you do when a region is dependent on development and movement of people out of that region puts that at risk? There are the political dimensions, the degree to which the current financial and economic systems strongly interact with our systems of government, and those are slow to change. There are the justice dimensions that are really prominent when it comes to who lives where. There are also the psychological dimensions. It's kind of funny in terms of introducing South Florida from afar and saying this is an incredibly climate exposed region, but when you go there, it's a tropical paradise, and it's really easy to ignore the fact that we have very real climate risks. So we heard things like this. In terms of climate retreat and migration, the fears are loss. I mean, it's like loss of property value, it's loss of community, it's loss of the tax base. Or as soon as you talk about retreat, it's just like there's no upside in that conversation. Or the hardest thing to talk about is the fact that there are people who are living in places that are just untenable right now, and there's nothing I can do to help them. There's nothing I or anyone else can do for you right now based on how our government systems work. And I will say in other research we've been doing with residents, this theme comes up again and again, people who are living in unsafe spaces, and there is no way for us to help them right now. Okay, the last thing we asked them was, how do they see the needs for increasing preparation through time? Recognizing that preparation is increasing, but it still isn't adequate in a lot of different ways. There's emphasis on the importance of collaboration, networks, science-based approaches, and increasing awareness through multifaceted approaches. So for example, again, returning to local resilience officer number 11, I don't think anyone can say that they're prepared for this, frankly. The incentives for local government to address climate migration are negative. There's a lot of disincentives. Or someone focused on a decision support role said, I think my organization is completely incapable at this point of really confronting the political situation in the state and at all presenting these topics. There's kind of like a pall of politics hanging over my organization. I'm trying to provide local governments policy examples whereby they start to move away from our historic focus on the local government liability if infrastructure services are not maintained, move away from that past assumption of perpetual infrastructure services. So across these interviews, and I really have only scratched the surface of what we unfolded, we heard again and again that the long-term transition plans, for example, beyond 2 feet of sea level rise, are inadequate and pose a lot of wide open questions in terms of how climate mobility in its diverse forms may unfold as climate impacts or adaptive responses. We also worked through the many different benefits, socioeconomically, environmentally, for example, as well as harms of these different forms of climate mobility, especially related to distributional inequities, socio-cultural and financial disruption. We unfolded really the ways that the inherent controversy of these issues intersects with political, financial, and social justice challenges. And finally, the ways that lived experiences especially have advanced conversations on these issues in combination with technical evidence, professional networks, and support in moving towards solutions. So I see the future for South Florida really being one where there is this tremendous potential to be much more proactive in how we put all of these different pieces together, recognizing that it is a place to really try hard and figure out novel solutions that likely will have a lot of transferability to places, and even those where you might have a hope of keeping the water out. So thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. My name is Ann-Christine Link, and I'm a PhD student at Philipps-Universität Marburg in Germany and a research assistant at the United Nations University in Bonn. Unfortunately, I cannot be with you today in person, but I'm sending warm greetings from Vienna, Austria. And today I will be talking about one of my papers. It's called Addressing Climate-Related Human Mobility Through NDCs and NAPs, State of Play, Good Practices, and the Ways Forward. And that's a paper I did together with Dennis Mohnbauer and Kees van der Geest. On the next slide, you can see the outline of today's presentation. So I'll start with giving a little bit of a definition of what NDCs and NAPs are for those who do not know yet. Then I will cover the reasons of why it is so important to integrate human mobility into NDCs and NAPs. and then I'll dive deeper into the actual paper, covering the methodology and also the main results. And then I'll wrap everything up with the key takeaways from this paper. So starting off with defining NDCs and NAPs. So NDCs is short for nationally determined contributions. And those are vehicles through which the parties to the Paris Agreement can communicate their commitments towards achieving the long-term goals that are presented in the Paris Agreement. And as a result, NDCs mainly focus on medium and long-term mitigation. So this means mitigation targets, but also how they want to achieve them. But some NDCs also include adaptation targets, but they do not have to. Quite differently, NAPs, which is short for National Adaptation Plans, they identify medium and long-term adaptation needs, so not mitigation anymore, but adaptation. And they also develop and implement strategies, plans, and programs to address those adaptation needs that they previously identified. So why it is so important that we should integrate human mobility, that we wrote a complete paper about this. So first of all, NDCs and NAPs are important processes to mainstream human mobility into national policy frameworks. And as a consequence, this can then catalyze solutions or maybe just discussions across all sectors and levels. One example is that if a country is coming up with a NAP, this can catalyze, for example, the development of a LAPA, which is short for Local Adaptation Plan. And then we would have this transition from the national to more like local level. And NDCs and NAPs can address human mobility very concretely in two different ways. So first of all, they can alleviate the pressures through adaptation and mitigation related to migration. It can avert displacement and also reduce the need for planned relocation / managed retreat. So NDCs and NAPs have the power to support those that do not want to move. At the same time, they can also support migration as adaptation. So supporting those that view migration as a possible adaptation strategy. One example for this is if a household is depending on agriculture, but this year climate change has made it very difficult for them to farm. If then one person out of this household, for example, has the opportunity to seasonally migrate for a job, this can then diversify the income and increase the resilience of this household. So as you can see, we have those two very different ways, but what we have been seeing from our review is that this second option of supporting migration as adaptation is often overlooked. Next, I would like to dive a bit deeper into the methodology that we used for this paper. Since we are trying to investigate the integration of human mobility into NDCs and NAPs, of course, we also had to analyze those policy documents. In total, we looked at 171 NDCs and 40 NAPs. On top of that, we also conducted workshops on this topic and then tried to integrate the insights that we gained from these workshops into our paper. On top of that, we also conducted 20 semi-structured interviews. This paper is a spin-off of a project that we did for FAO. And for this project for FAO, we picked 7 case study countries: Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, Fiji, Nepal, Bangladesh, Argentina, and Guatemala. So for these interviews, we interviewed about 33 different stakeholders from these countries. They came from governments, CSOs, UN agencies, and experts in the field. And we also integrated these insights that we gained from these interviews into our paper. With this figure, I would like to present the main results when we assess the integration of human mobility into NDCs and NAPs. And what you can see in this figure is the percentage of NDCs and NAPs that do not reference the three types of mobility that we looked at: migration, displacement, and relocation, those that made concrete provisions, and those that simply mentioned this type of human mobility. And what we can see here is that NAPs reference human mobility way more often than NDCs do. So if we look at migration, we can see that only 33% of NDCs mention migration, whereas about 65% of NAPs actually do. And for displacement and relocation, we can see that this gap of mentioning displacement and relocation is even larger between NDCs and NAPs. The next main result is that migration, at least for NDCs, tend to be mentioned most often. So if we take a look at this lower line here, migration is mentioned most often, followed by displacement and relocation. For NAPs, the upper line, it's a little bit different because here displacement is actually mentioned most often, followed by migration, and then we have relocation. Since I do not want to show just graphs, but also give you some in-text examples from the NDCs and NAPs, I want to show you how referencing these types of mobility can actually look like. The first example is from Albania's NDCs, and it's a reference of migration, which is extremely short, but it already counts as a reference. They simply say sea level rise causes migration landwards, and that's all they're doing. That's a reference, and it counts, I would say, in our paper. Next, we have a reference of displacement by Papua New Guinea's NDC, and they give a little bit more context. So they say both the Manap and the Carteret Islands in PNG have been impacted by the environmental degradation and climate change hazards, which has resulted in the displacement of communities from these islands. Then we have another very interesting reference from Bangladesh SNAP. They do not only mention planned relocation or planned resettlement, but also migration by saying planned resettlement to halt climate migration is considered one potential policy initiative. One of the last main results that we found is that NAPs do not only reference human mobility types more often, but they also make more concrete provisions. And what we mean with that is that they do not simply reference it, but they also provide some strategies, for example, of how they want to support people that are on the move, that are being displaced, or that are being relocated. And we can see that these differences are quite large for all three different types of human mobility, but actually largest for relocation. And I brought another example with me where you can see a concrete provision in regards to displacement. And this actually comes from Kenya SNAP. And here they are saying, through focus on gender, vulnerable groups, and youth, the government is committed to alleviate the condition of vulnerable persons. And then there's a list of different people and communities, and internally and externally displaced people are among this vulnerable group. The next thing I want to mention is that migration is often viewed as a problem, which is very unfortunate, and that many countries or NDCs and NAPs do not really have a balanced view of human mobility, so seeing the positive and the negative sides. So I brought one example where we can see that migration is viewed as a problem, and one example where migration is more viewed as an adaptation strategy. For the example where migration is viewed as a problem, I'm not giving the reference where it is coming from, because it's not about pinpointing at the examples that do not have a balanced view yet, but more focusing on the good example. So currently, country X is experiencing rapid urbanization due to fairly high rates of rural-urban migration, leading to the prevalence of squatter settlements near urban centers that continue to escalate in spite of the government's intervention to regulate. Consequently, country X does not view migration as an acceptable adaptation strategy. So they make it very clear, migration as adaptation does not apply or does not seem to apply to their country context. On a more positive note, we have the NAP by South Sudan. And here they actually do recognize that migration will become a de facto adaptation strategy for many people. So we did not only just look at the integration of human mobility, but also challenges, which make it a bit more difficult for countries to actually integrate it. So there are three main challenges. First, there's a lack of finance, a lack of institutional capacity, and a lack of data. So first, I'm giving you a bit more context about this lack of finance. Of course, there are funding opportunities available, but they tend to be very limited, bureaucratic, and consequently very time-consuming. And all of this information on the slide is coming from the interviews with stakeholders. So this is what stakeholders have been telling us. And even if the funding is accepted, the funding amounts are often not sufficient to really tick all the boxes or address all the needs that were previously identified. Next, we have this lack of institutional capacities. So we have certain ministries that are in charge of developing and implementing NDCs and NAPs. And usually the work on NDCs and NAPs is simply added to their day-to-day obligations without any adequate compensation. And as a consequence, ministries tend to work in silos, which then of course limits cooperation and coordination, which is in the end needed to come up with a very good NDC and NAP. Lastly, there is a huge lack of data, which can be linked to lack of technology, infrastructure, and expertise in data science. And for all of the researchers in the field of human mobility, we know there's a huge lack of data when it comes to human mobility, especially when talking about internal migration. And this is what is often happening in the context of climate change. And if data exists, it is often not disaggregated by, for example, sex or gender or different ethnicity backgrounds. And if this kind of data is already limited, data on how human mobility is actually linked to climate change is even more rare. And with this, I would like to conclude my presentation by providing you with the three main takeaways. So first of all, keep in mind, NDCs and NAPs are important vehicles for mainstreaming the integration of human mobility into climate policies. Second, NAPs compared to NDCs do reference not only human mobility more often, but they also make concrete provisions more often. And third, there are 4 different current challenges that currently need to be overcome. First, we should move away from this solely negative view of human mobility in the context of climate change, trying to have a more balanced view of human mobilities, so seeing the positive and negatives, trying to overcome this lack of finance, a lack of institutional capacity of the in-charge ministries, and also overcoming the lack of data and also therefore evidence. And with this, I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions right now or just shoot me a message and I will get back to you. Thank you.